2 of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. You know the drill. We're recording on Wednesday morning. We're also going to be rejoining our race class, which we missed last week, but we can't miss it because we do it every month and have been doing it now for years. But before I introduce my professor, Jonathan Feingold, someone just sent me something from Gavin Newsom. He is having way too much fun driving Trump nuts. And apparently this dropped last night. And you see Gavin Newsom sitting on a bed that's coming out of an MRI. All right. And then you see the nurse and a bunch of people all holding up signs that say 10, 10, 10. And this is what it says. And it's all in caps, which is what Donald Trump loves to do. He loves to do everything in caps. And he writes, "Your favorite governor, that's me, just had the most perfectest MRI in history, folks. They put me in the machine and then came the readings. Everything was computer. It was big. It was beautiful. It was computer readings. They were so huge. They went off the charts. No, really, they had to borrow extra charts from other hospitals just to make it fit." The nurse said, "Sir, your gray matter isn't even gray. It's pure gold." And then the doctor looked at me with tears coming down his eyes and said, "Oh, sir, your brain waves are so perfect. They're spelling the word perfect. How is this even possible? I've never seen anything like it." Just to be sure, the doctor ordered his staff to rate it from 1 to 10. And can you believe it? I got perfect 10s all across. It was so perfect. Patients from all over the hospital heard about it and came rushing to see for themselves. All kinds of patients too. Even blind patients were scrambling to sneak a peek. Cancer patients were walking out of their chemo sessions. Paraplegic patients even ran out and trampled over the blind cancer patients for the chance to witness history. Many people are saying, my big, beautiful brain may have even cured them. Just like, Jesus. Everybody's talking about it. Believe me. Thank you for your attention to this brain matter. Of course, Gavin Newsom. Oh my God, I want to write his material. That's all I have to say. And it's very interesting, and I'm going to remind everyone that this is race class, and with race class, we're up to episode 44. We're going to be hanging out with Jonathan Feingold, who we've been sort of teaching this class about race and racism because of the attack on it. But Jonathan, you know why I had to read that story? Is that my father was very conservative. I mean, like uber conservative. But my father used to tell me that whenever anyone would attack me, don't get mad, get funny. All right. That's what my dad told me. And the reason why what Gavin Newsom is doing is exactly what I have done in the past, is that it was the last week and a half before my election for governor, which I did not win, but I had won the primary. And I'm before the largest chamber in the entire state. So there's like 1,000 people in the room, all the big business people. And here I am, the first girl to not only win a primary, but I'm running on, guess what? An income tax. Oh my God. So I get up there. And the first question is the following. Excuse me, lady, have you ever held a job? All right. And all the women in the room just looked at him and were like ready to give him a knuckle sandwich. And you hear this groan. And I'm holding on to the podium and I'm hearing my father say, "Don't get mad, be funny. Don't get mad, be funny." And I looked at him and I said, "Wow, really good question." I said, I woke up this morning and I said, should I make brownies or run for governor? I said, the brownies were only 78 cents. I would have been done in 45 minutes. What a fool. And then I looked at him and I smiled and I said, "So why did you ask me that question?" And so then I proceeded to say, because you weren't used to a woman standing up here. You weren't used to a young woman wearing maybe even a short skirt. You looked at me and saw maybe a nursery school teacher. Maybe you saw an elementary school teacher. Maybe you saw someone that worked in your library. But sadly, what you didn't see, and then I went through my whole resume, and then the last thing I said after describing all the things I had done, from being a developer, for working at a poverty agency, for being a legislator, for all these other things I had done, I said, and here's the sad thing, you don't see a governor, but here's the good news, you'll get used to it. And that's the humor. So I just want people to know sometimes it's more stinging than any rage you could ever have. So with that as my bizarre introduction to race class, I want to remind everyone that legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country, trust me, everywhere. But in an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and me, we've been offering race class once a month so that we can actually approach the conversation of race and racism from a place of curiosity and, most important, Jonathan, history. History. And the reason why that history piece is so important is exactly what I said to you, which is, what are we going to talk about today, Jonathan? And you said, well, Arnie, we're going to talk about the teach-in that I was part of at the Smithsonian on Sunday. And then you sent me an article from The Guardian, and it was entitled, Why We're Holding a Teach-In About American History at the Smithsonian. So let me welcome you back to the program. Thank you for holding my hand for all these years and for putting up with my introductions, which are so bizarre. But more importantly, the timing of our conversation is perfect with our first half of our show, which we were talking about, like, what can we do beside the rallies and no kings? And she gave us sort of a 10-point plan of things that people could do. But in part, this teaching at the Smithsonian was also something we can do. So let me welcome you back to the program and describe to my audience what happened over the weekend, because I think this is incredibly important. And we need to understand one of the biggest things you see over and over again with a fascist authoritarian takeover is the attempt to either white out history, rewrite history, or to suggest, as I think Donald Trump does on many occasions, Jonathan, there was no history till he got elected. So welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Arnie. It's great to be here. I appreciate your intro story. I will offer a few reflections in response. One is I do love the use of humor, and I think scholars of fascism, what they are telling us is that fascist authoritarians don't do well with humor,
No.
in part because so much of the power comes from projection that just gets internalized. And so much of what we, don't just see here with Trump, but in other authoritarian autocratic regimes is a need, an existential need in order to project because there is a deep insecurity because all authoritarian projects are inherently unstable.
Mm-hmm.
And humor is really nice at diffusing that, which I think is also why the use of giant frog costumes,
Yes.
other comical costumes, music, just humor, farcical things in order to juxtapose who we are against, the violent, militaristic assault on our communities through ICE and other federal agencies has been so effective. Couple things about Gavin. So I think in this moment, it is critical for there to be many different flanks, many different strategies
Yeah.
that are countering the Trump administration and the broader right effort to wholly consolidate, concentrate power. So that because that leads to moments like where we are right now, and where there is the country has excess wealth and is choosing essentially the GOP and the White House are choosing to deny access to food to tens of millions of Americans, including about 300,000 students in Massachusetts through the loss of SNAP. While the Trump administration is sending 40 billion to Argentina to fund someone's pet project as part of the grift, while Trump spends tens of millions, entering, I think, getting close to a billion on his White House demolition, um, and which is just to say, great, Gavin Newsom continued to poke at Trump, undermine his legitimacy in all sorts of ways. I don't, though, want us to recast Gavin Newsom as some
Oh, I know.
um, uh, ally in terms of a meaningfully deep project of um, building multiracial democracy in this country, among other, he is what he is. But one thing that he did concretely that I think is wholly inexcusable is so California, they have had this incredibly robust and rigorous uh, state-created reparations committee that has been doing a ton of research on the need for reparations in California, how one might actually um, operationalize that in policy. And the state legislature passed a bill that I don't have the language in front of me, but essentially what it would have done, and within the state, it would have rendered so individuals who can trace their personal ancestry to someone who was enslaved, that would have been a positive consideration in the admissions process in higher
Mhm.
education. It's a wholly sort of, it's just a common sense way to, in the most sort of modest, um, it's a common sense, modest
Right.
way to counteract one of the most pernicious, just forms of racial terrorism in this country, in the present. It's also wholly constitutional. It 100% aligns with the Supreme Court's recent decision with Harvard because it is not turning on a person's racial identity, but rather it's their individual lineage to someone who was
Right.
enslaved.
It's to ownership. It's to ownership. It's to
And
ownership. Yes.
Newsom vetoed it.
Wow. So
So,
let me just say
and
something. I am not, Gavin Newsom is not going to be my candidate going into the future, but I am also going to say he's useful. And right now, we need as many useful ways of bringing attention to what is happening here. And I think that if that is the case, then I will use him. Okay? That doesn't mean I support him on everything. Look, I married a man that I didn't agree with on a lot of things, but I still figured out a way to marry him. Okay? I'm not marrying Gavin, but I am saying that Gavin has given us an approach that is useful. And if I can trigger people in understanding exactly what he is doing and the sort of the ridiculousness of Donald Trump, I mean, that's what he's doing. He's using Trump against Trump, okay, in a way that we both smile, laugh, and go, "Oh my God, how true it is." But you're right about the fact that he is a disappointment, and there is no question he is a disappointment. And Jonathan, I never have genuflected to someone because they happen to be a D or an R. I've always been very honest, and my governor, who was named Jean Shaheen, who became a U.S. senator. Okay, she was the first female governor. I wrote the piece in the Boston Globe about her reign as governor. Do you know what the title of the piece was? Majestic Disappointment. All right. So I get it, but that doesn't mean that she wasn't better than the alternative. I have to kind of look at this, but right now, what I value about Gavin Newsom is that we need that kind of very funny punch in order to get people to pay attention. And if it works, it works. So that's what I'm going to say. Now let's go to Smithsonian because I
let's
think
go to the Smithsonian.
because I want to talk about this teaching because I think this is also very important given what Donald Trump is doing with his attack on higher education, with his attack on public education, with his attack on DEI and CRT and everything else. It isn't just generic. There is really a raison d'etre for this, and I think that explains in part the teaching at the Smithsonian.
Yes. So let's talk Smithsonian. And I think generally good teaching, or part of good teaching, involves some repetition. And so we're going to endeavor to repeat a couple of things. We never have enough time. And so uh,
That's
it's
fine.
possible that you'll cut me off before we repeat again. Um, but so to start, why is the Trump regime attacking the Smithsonian? And the attacks have come in many forms, including an executive order from earlier this year titled quote unquote, Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History from March 27th of this year, uh, and includes language like this: once widely respected as a symbol of American excellence and a global icon of cultural achievement, the Smithsonian Institution has, in recent years, come under the influence of a divisive, race-centered ideology. And now I'm sort of jumping down, and it sort of takes issue with a particular set of exhibits at the Smithsonian, and then concludes the paragraph with: the exhibit further claims that sculpture has been a powerful tool in promoting scientific racism and promotes the view that race is not a biological reality, but a social construct, stating race is a human invention. Any listener of this program knows that race is a human invention. That's actually not all that contested. It's not that hard to appreciate it in the same way that currency, money, human invention, the borders that separate nations, human invention, these things, nation states, also human inventions. None of that sort of pre-exists the society in which we live. And so why is it that the Smithsonian, a museums, what are museums going to do? That a museum that has an exhibit that is exposing people to the myth that race is biological, and it providing them information about how this thing called race is socially constructed. Why is that a threat? Why does that require an executive order like this? And I think to understand that requires understanding how what we are seeing um, in like what the regime represents is essentially a fusion of racism and fascism. Or maybe it's just fascism that is where it's connective tissue is the sort of white supremacist racial logics that um, uh, really sort of in many respects were born in this country, though certainly are not limited to it. Um, and so part of it is that, and so folks like Jason Stanley, they tell us that uh, one of the central um, tenets of fascist regimes is the need to create, to construct a mythic past.
Yes.
And in the United States, as you know, listening to folks like Trump, that mythic past is one in which we are pure, where we've always been committed to. Here, let me. I can. There's got to be language. Oh yeah. So yeah, the executive order starts. Americans have witnessed a concerted and widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth. Under this historical revision, our nation's unparalleled legacy of advancing liberty, individual rights, and human happiness is reconstructed as inherently racist, sexist, oppressive, and otherwise irredeemably flawed. Now, question whether irredeemably should go there, but any any casual observer of history understands that a country that um, was founded, that thrived on the back of um, conquest and genocide of the indigenous people who lived here and the institution of slavery, um, you know, and in, which formal power was limited to men, not women. This was, inherently racist, sexist, and oppressive. Um, and so the mythic past in the United States context has to strip away all the ways in which racial hierarchy and gender hierarchy have always been central to the community in which we live. And then it's like, okay, well, why? Um, and then like, what would you like? What sort of this project of this, like creating a mythic past, like a commitment to that scrubs from the text, from our public discourse, truth about, racial hierarchy. Um, what would you
I
call that? What would you say it's about making America what again? It's a
well,
commitment to make America
white again.
great again?
Great. Well,
Yeah.
but Jonathan, as I was reading the article at the Guardian and I was reading about what you did at the Smithsonian, one of the reasons why he cherry picks history, rewrites history, whitewashes history, is that he wants history, if it even existed before Donald Trump, to suggest that he was the goal. That if you look at our history, that his election is really what we have been moving in the direction of. He's kind of like, the seal of the prophet. Okay. So if you look at the history as he wants it to be understood, it leads to a Trump. It leads to a Trump because you managed to cut out everything else that would suggest instead of him being a failure and an assault on democracy, he is the answer and the solution. And I really do see that that really is his goal. And that's why when you look at the history and the attack on the institutions and what's happening with higher ed, it all is to even suggest that anything that would suggest a flaw, that would suggest that he is the flaw, has to be removed.
So I don't disagree with that, but I think it's more than that. And so if we think about, so why the fascination with biology? Like why are you taking pot shots at the um, essentially uncontestable notion that this thing we call race is socially constructed? And I think a big part of it is that if you can sort of um, uh, revive the notion in public discourse through folks like Joe Rogan, for example, or Charlie Kirk, for example, that race is biological in its essence, and that the genders, the sexes, are the differences are biological in their essence, then what you are one of the things that you then can claim is that the inequities that we continue to see across society, the disparities, racial disparities, gender disparities, that we see that not because there's something called systemic racism at play, but because that's natural. Because actually, society is supposed to be ordered in a way that ends with racial inequality. And so, like, when you're trying to sort of think, it's like, why folks like Chris Rufo or Charlie Kirk uh, or Trump identify the start of the problem in the 60s and the Civil Rights Act as the problem? It's because if your view of the world is one that it's all biological and there actually is a hierarchy, then absent inappropriate government intervention, we are going to get Fortune 500 companies that are all white dudes, where everyone elected to government is a white dude. Why it's natural to ask the question to you, Arnie, what are you doing here? Because it actually, because, and so then any countermeasure, anything under the umbrella of affirmative action or diversity, equity, inclusion is it's not just, divisive in some way, but it's actually money poorly spent because it's just simply going to be, you know, putting into some position that they are inevitably and perpetually unqualified for someone who couldn't be there. But then it's like, okay, like that's like pretty crappy sort of politics, like ideology, but why? Sort of circling back to this fascism thing. And so I just want to read from an op-ed that Jason Stanley and Kimberly Crenshaw co-authored a little while ago, where they were talking specifically about attacks from the Smithsonian. And this, I think, really, in essence, is helpful to understand MAGA in a lot of ways. So fascism, they write, always has a central cultural component because it relies on the construction of a mythic past. The mythic past is central to fascism because it enables and empowers a sense of grievance
Yes.
by a dominant racial or ethnic group whose consent is crucial to the sustainability of the project. And so MAGA is a project of racial grievance. So right now, we're in this moment in which you have the Trump administration is eviscerating the social safety net that in material ways serves far more people in the United States in absolute terms who would racially identify as white than people of color.
Hmm.
But there is, W.E. Du Bois, he coined the term a century ago-ish, the psychological wages of whiteness
Right.
to explain why poor whites, and certainly it's not just folks who, are suffer socioeconomic precarity that are part of MAGA, but why like, poor whites are going to align with the elites, with the autocrats, if it means that they suffer like materially. And part of it is because whiteness has always provided psychological benefits. Um,
Yes.
and so, we I was just told we only have 2 minutes left,
Yeah.
which is not fair because we haven't even started talking about the teaching.
All
So
right.
let
Well,
me,
I'll get you to come back, so don't worry about it. I'm good at this. I get to like regroup. All right, keep going. Keep going.
so let me just say a couple words about the teaching. Um, so I was on too many airplanes over the past week, but the final leg of the trips I was on was through DC. I landed about 9 p.m. on Saturday so that I could attend the morning of this day-long teaching at the Smithsonian that was hosted by two very cool podcasts this day, which includes Jody. Oh, I don't know Jody's last name. I should. And Nicole Hemmer and Kelly Carter Jackson and the Memory Palace by Nate DeMeo. I actually apologies to everyone. I can't remember
Doesn't
last
matter.
names and don't know how to pronounce it. Doesn't matter. But they sort of reaching back to the tradition of teach-ins in order to create spaces in which we can have conversations that the authorities are trying to purge from our communities in all sorts of interesting, cool ways. And so I wake up at like 6:30 on Sunday in DC, frigid morning, pop in to get coffee. Sort of interesting because there's National Guard troops all armed up, also getting their coffee, which is just this reminder of being in DC
Yeah.
when, the troops are there to police the people. And the Smithsonian is shut down because the regime is not allowing any public goods to be accessed by the people. and when Trump is demolishing the White House. And then I get to participate in the morning of this day-long teaching. And there was a moment where I was tired, like prepping. I'm just like, why did I add a stop? And I have to say, it felt so good to be there,
Yes,
to
of course.
participate, to listen to the community, to just have different folks who understand the world in different sorts of ways come together and share that collectively, communally, in what was just a manifestation of such a different sort of mode of engagement than the utter brutality and destruction that we are seeing from, the regime.
And you were bathed in truth and facts and all these different people with all this different knowledge coming together. I'm jealous. I'm just jealous. Um, every month we do race class, and race class is really about responding to the idea that we have to teach about race and racism, and that we have to do it in such a way that people feel a sense of knowledge, that people get a sense of what it means, and that's really what we do. If you are curious, if you want to understand history rather than fear and anxiety, it's why you tune in to Race Class with Jonathan Feingold of Boston University. Thank you so much for doing this, Jonathan.
Thanks, Arnie. Always a pleasure.
This, everyone, is the Thursday edition of The Attitude. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.